There are moments in training when you realize the drill was never about the drill itself. The early morning at the remote United States Marine Corps training facility began under a pale gray sky, with low humidity and a light wind moving across the open tactical range. The air carried the sharp scent of dry grass and cold metal, while distant instructions echoed faintly from an adjacent formation yard. The trainees had already assembled in full gear, rifles secured in controlled ready positions, awaiting the next operational simulation under the supervision of Captain Jason Miller, a disciplined instructor known for strict procedural adherence. Sergeant Kyle Anderson moved along the line with measured steps, checking posture, spacing, and communication discipline, his voice calm but precise as he reinforced containment protocol for the scenario they were about to execute. At the edge of the designated training zone, an older man stood partially outside the marked boundary line, his presence quiet and unassuming, dressed in a simple worn field jacket with no visible insignia, observing the structured activity with an expression that revealed neither confusion nor concern. The trainees noticed him almost immediately, but their interpretation was shaped by assumption rather than verification, and within seconds he was categorized internally as an unauthorized civilian presence near a restricted operational exercise area. Captain Miller observed this shift without interruption, allowing the situation to develop within controlled parameters, as part of a behavioral response evaluation that was not yet disclosed to the trainees. Sergeant Anderson issued a standard containment instruction, directing the unit to maintain position and apply procedural awareness, while subtle tension began to form within the formation as uncertainty replaced routine confidence. The older man did not move away, nor did he respond verbally to the visible attention directed toward him. Instead, he remained still, his gaze scanning the formation with a calm precision that did not match the expectation of a confused outsider. One trainee adjusted his stance slightly, tightening grip on his rifle in accordance with training protocol, while another whispered a confirmation request that went unanswered due to the structured silence of the exercise environment. Captain Miller noted every reaction, every hesitation, and every deviation from standard discipline, but maintained silence, allowing the psychological pressure of uncertainty to test their cohesion. The wind shifted slightly across the range, carrying the sound of distant equipment calibration, and the older man finally took a small step forward, not crossing the boundary line, but positioning himself in a way that aligned his view directly with the center of the formation. That movement, subtle and controlled, created an immediate ripple of attention, as several trainees instinctively adjusted their posture, unsure whether the action represented compliance, defiance, or simple disregard for instruction. Sergeant Anderson narrowed his focus, analyzing the situation through procedural logic, while Captain Miller remained still, his expression unchanged, as if recognizing something beneath the surface that had not yet been articulated. The training scenario was no longer perceived as routine, but as an unfolding variable that required interpretation beyond standard doctrine. And in that quiet shift, the environment itself seemed to slow, as if awaiting a decision that had not yet been given. The structured silence that followed the subtle shift in posture at the training range did not break, but instead deepened into a controlled atmosphere of observation where every participant began interpreting the situation through different layers of procedural understanding. Sergeant Kyle Anderson stepped forward with deliberate precision, reinforcing containment protocol in a measured tone that emphasized control over uncertainty, instructing the trainees to maintain formation integrity and continue situational awareness as part of the ongoing evaluation exercise. Captain Jason Miller remained slightly behind the main line of observation, his posture unchanged, his attention fixed on the older man at the edge of the zone, whose presence continued to defy the expected behavioral patterns of an unauthorized civilian. The trainees, still operating under the assumption of a standard security simulation, adjusted their spacing and readiness posture in accordance with drill standards, but subtle hesitation began to emerge in their movements, as if the initial classification of the situation no longer fully aligned with what they were observing in real time. The older man did not retreat or assert himself verbally. Instead, he maintained a calm observational stance, his focus moving across the formation with an analytical precision that suggested familiarity with structured tactical environments rather than confusion or discomfort. Sergeant Anderson initiated a controlled procedural sequence designed to test response discipline under ambiguous conditions, signaling the trainees to apply containment positioning while maintaining non-escalatory posture, a standard method used to evaluate judgment under uncertainty. As the formation adjusted, one trainee corrected his alignment slightly too slowly, another overcompensated with excessive rigidity, and these minor deviations became increasingly visible to Captain Miller, who noted them without immediate intervention. The older man observed these adjustments quietly, his expression unchanged, but his gaze lingered briefly on specific formation inconsistencies, as if recognizing inefficiencies that were not yet acknowledged by the group itself. A faint tension developed in the air, not from confrontation, but from the increasing awareness that the situation was not fully defined by the training parameters initially assumed by the trainees. Sergeant Anderson repeated a confirmation directive, ensuring communication discipline remained intact, while Captain Miller subtly shifted his weight, indicating heightened attention without breaking his observational role. The trainees began to interpret the older man's continued stillness as a form of resistance or ambiguity, reinforcing their internal classification of him as an external variable within the exercise environment. However, the older man then made a minimal adjustment in stance, a controlled repositioning of his feet and shoulders that aligned his perspective directly with the central axis of the formation, an action so precise and efficient that it immediately altered the attention dynamics within the group. Without speaking, he raised one hand slightly, not as a gesture of command, but as a correctional reference point, and in that moment, one trainee unconsciously mirrored a micro-adjustment in posture, tightening alignment in a way that improved formation stability. Captain Miller noticed this immediately, his expression narrowing slightly as he registered the significance of such an involuntary correction occurring without instruction or verbal communication. Sergeant Anderson paused for a fraction longer than protocol required, recalculating the situation as behavioral anomaly rather than standard deviation. The trainees, sensing a shift in energy but lacking full context, became more disciplined in their posture, reducing unnecessary movement and increasing focus. The older man lowered his hand back to a neutral position and resumed observation, yet the impact of that brief adjustment remained visible in the formation, which now appeared subtly more cohesive. Captain Miller's attention intensified, not through urgency, but through recognition of something that did not align with the expected profile of an uninvolved civilian presence, while Sergeant Anderson began preparing a controlled escalation of identity verification procedures through secure communication channels. The environment remained quiet, but the psychological structure of the exercise had fundamentally changed, as procedural certainty began giving way to measured uncertainty, and every participant, knowingly or not, started recalibrating their understanding of who was being observed and who was truly conducting the observation. The controlled atmosphere at the training range continued to shift from structured evaluation into a more complex state of procedural uncertainty, as Sergeant Kyle Anderson initiated a low-level communication sequence through his secured radio channel, requesting a discrete identity verification check on the unidentified older man positioned near the center axis of the exercise zone. The request was not issued with urgency, but with the precision of protocol designed for situations where classification ambiguity begins to affect operational interpretation. Captain Jason Miller remained in his observational stance, his attention locked on the subject whose presence no longer fit within any standard civilian or trainee category, while the trainees maintained formation discipline with increasing rigidity, sensing that the exercise parameters were being reinterpreted in real time by command oversight. The older man remained still, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady and methodical as it moved across the formation, observing not with detachment, but with a level of familiarity that suggested deep operational awareness. Within moments, Sergeant Anderson received an initial response through his earpiece, a partial confirmation signal that flagged the name under restricted classification review, causing a brief but noticeable shift in his demeanor as he repeated the identifier internally to ensure accuracy. Captain Miller noticed this subtle change immediately and adjusted his focus without breaking protocol visibility, understanding that the situation had transitioned from routine training oversight into a controlled verification process involving higher authority channels. The trainees, still unaware of the communication exchange occurring above their clearance level, interpreted the continued silence from command as part of the evaluation structure, reinforcing discipline while gradually suppressing uncertainty. However, small behavioral inconsistencies began to emerge within the formation as individual awareness of the older man's composure and precision began to override initial assumptions. Sergeant Anderson initiated a secondary confirmation request, escalating the verification priority level within the secure network, which resulted in a delayed but increasingly definitive response pattern indicating a historical military service record under Marine Corps engineering classification with restricted operational annotation. Captain Miller received a filtered notification on his secured device, and his expression shifted subtly as he processed the partial declassification. Indicators embedded within the file header, recognizing that the subject was not an ordinary civilian presence, but a former Marine Corps asset with documented field engineering experience exceeding standard instructional parameters. The realization did not result in immediate verbal acknowledgement, but it altered his internal command assessment of the situation, causing him to reassess every prior instruction given during the exercise. The older man, still standing in the same position, appeared unaffected by the procedural escalation occurring around him, yet his presence now carried a different weight within the formation, as trainees began to subconsciously adjust their spacing and posture with increased precision. One trainee attempted a verbal confirmation request, but was immediately signaled to remain silent by Sergeant Anderson, who maintained strict communication discipline while awaiting full clearance confirmation. Captain Miller finally took a slow step forward, not as an act of confrontation, but as a measured adjustment in supervisory proximity, acknowledging that the exercise had evolved into an unplanned recognition scenario. The environment remained quiet, but the structure of authority within the training range had begun to reorganize itself, no longer centered solely on instructional hierarchy, but influenced by the emerging verification of identity that was still unfolding through secure command channels. The older man's calm observation continued uninterrupted, yet every individual present now perceived that calmness differently, as if it carried an implicit understanding of systems, procedures, and operational realities that extended beyond the current exercise framework. Sergeant Anderson held the formation in place, awaiting final confirmation, while Captain Miller prepared for the inevitable transition from training protocol to formal acknowledgement protocol, as the boundary between unknown participant and recognized Marine Corps legacy began to dissolve under the weight of verified classification data. The confirmation cycle reached its critical threshold as Sergeant Kyle Anderson received the final classification response through the secured communication channel, and the tone of his expression shifted from procedural focus to controlled recognition of verified identity data that had been partially declassified under high-level authorization review. Without announcing the contents aloud, he adjusted his posture and lowered his communication device slightly, signaling that the verification process had moved beyond uncertainty and into confirmed status. Captain Jason Miller observed this change immediately, his attention sharpening as he interpreted the nonverbal confirmation cues that indicated a completed identity match within restricted Marine Corps historical records. The trainees, still holding formation discipline, sensed a change in authority atmosphere, but remained unaware of the specific nature of the update, only recognizing that command behavior had shifted from evaluation mode into acknowledgement mode. The older man remained in the same position near the center axis of the training zone, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and steady, as if the verification process occurring around him had no influence on his internal state. Sergeant Anderson took a measured step forward, not toward confrontation but toward procedural transition, and issued a quiet directive to maintain formation integrity while preparing for protocol adjustment. Captain Miller then moved forward in alignment with Anderson, both now operating under the same understanding that the subject under observation was no longer classified as an unknown civilian presence, but as a verified former United States Marine Corps combat engineering specialist with documented operational history that extended into restricted evaluation categories. The atmosphere across the training range shifted subtly but unmistakably as the trainees began to lower unnecessary tension in their stance without formal instruction, responding instinctively to the change in command energy. One trainee attempted to reassert standard containment posture, but quickly corrected himself as he noticed the altered tone of authority in the supervising officers. The older man finally made a minimal movement, shifting his weight slightly to a more neutral stance, not as a response to command, but as a natural adjustment following the stabilization of the environment around him. Captain Miller stopped at a respectful distance, his expression now fully composed under recognition protocol, and acknowledged the subject with a controlled nod that signaled procedural respect within military hierarchy. Sergeant Anderson followed suit, maintaining silence while updating internal communication channels to reflect confirmed status change from unidentified participant to recognized legacy personnel. The trainees, observing this without full context, began to experience a gradual transformation in perception, as the individual they had initially categorized as a potential civilian intrusion was now being treated under formal recognition behavior by their own instructors. The training range, once structured around evaluation and containment simulation, now functioned as a space of acknowledgement and recalibration, where authority was no longer centered solely on rank, but on verified historical contribution. The older man did not speak or gesture beyond his steady presence. Yet his calm observation now carried a different meaning for everyone present, as if the environment itself had redefined his position within it. Captain Miller maintained formal stillness, understanding that the moment required restraint rather than instruction, while Sergeant Anderson ensured all communication channels reflected accurate classification status. The formation remained intact, but its psychological structure had changed completely, transitioning from assessment under uncertainty to disciplined recognition under confirmed identity, marking a silent but definitive turning point in the exercise. The secured communication network reached full stabilization as the final classification confirmation was processed through the United States Marine Corps archival system, and Sergeant Kyle Anderson received the complete identity profile under restricted historical designation, confirming that the older man present on the training range was a former combat engineering specialist with operational service history that had been formally evaluated at the highest levels of internal command review. Without breaking protocol, Anderson maintained silence for several seconds, absorbing the implications of the verification before adjusting his stance to a more formal acknowledgement posture, signaling to Captain Jason Miller that the identity transition from unknown subject to recognized legacy status had been fully completed. Captain Miller responded with a controlled nod, his expression remaining composed but visibly aligned with the weight of the confirmation as he processed the shift from training oversight scenario to formal recognition protocol. Across the formation, the trainees continued to hold position, still unaware of the full scope of classification details, but increasingly sensitive to the change in tone and behavior exhibited by their supervising officers. The older man remained steady at the center axis of the training zone, his posture unchanged, his calm presence now understood within a completely different framework of interpretation, no longer seen as external ambiguity, but as verified historical military experience. Sergeant Anderson initiated a quiet procedural adjustment, instructing the formation to maintain disciplined stillness while command-level acknowledgement procedures were prepared, ensuring that no further training actions would interfere with recognition protocol. Captain Miller took a measured step forward, closing distance slightly but maintaining formal respect boundaries, and addressed the situation with restrained authority, confirming through nonverbal acknowledgement that standard exercise parameters were now suspended in favor of recognition status transition. The trainees began to sense a fundamental change in the structure of the environment, as the psychological framework of the exercise shifted from evaluation of an unknown presence to acknowledgement of a distinguished former service member whose history extended beyond their operational understanding. One trainee lowered his rifle posture incrementally without instruction, mirroring a broader shift in formation discipline as awareness of the situation deepened through observation of instructor behavior. The older man made a minimal adjustment in stance, aligning his shoulders with a neutral rest position, not as a response to command, but as a natural return to stillness following the stabilization of authority dynamics around him. Captain Miller maintained steady eye-line contact, then issued a quiet directive to ensure full procedural respect was observed, reinforcing that all personnel were now operating under recognition protocol rather than containment or assessment conditions. Sergeant Anderson updated the communication channel to reflect finalized classification status, ensuring that all internal systems acknowledged the subject as a verified Marine Corps legacy figure with documented operational history. The training environment, once defined by controlled uncertainty, now functioned as a structured recognition space, where every movement and silence carried different meaning under the confirmed identity framework. The formation remained intact, but its purpose had fundamentally changed as discipline transitioned from evaluation readiness to formal respect posture. The older man did not seek attention or acknowledgement beyond what was procedurally required, yet his presence now shaped the entire atmosphere of the range, anchoring it in a quiet but irreversible moment of institutional recognition that concluded the verification process without disruption or conflict. The final stage of recognition protocol settled across the training range as the secured command network completed its last synchronization cycle, and all systems confirmed that the identity of the older man had been fully verified under United States Marine Corps historical classification records, transitioning the environment from procedural evaluation into formal acknowledgement status. Sergeant Kyle Anderson maintained disciplined stillness for several seconds after the confirmation, ensuring that every communication channel reflected consistent classification data before lowering his device and signaling silent completion of the verification process. Captain Jason Miller observed this transition with controlled composure, his posture steady but visibly aligned with the gravity of the confirmed identity. As the training scenario had now fully transformed into a recognition event governed by institutional respect rather than instructional assessment. Across the formation, the trainees remained in position, their understanding still incomplete, but their behavior increasingly influenced by the altered tone of command presence, as the environment no longer reflected ambiguity but established acknowledgement of legacy status. The older man remained centered within the training zone, his posture unchanged, his expression calm and neutral, as if the procedural confirmation surrounding him had simply aligned external perception with a reality that had always existed. Sergeant Anderson issued a quiet directive through controlled channels, instructing all personnel to maintain formal discipline posture while ensuring no further training procedures were executed, as the situation had entered a recognition protocol phase requiring stability and restraint. Captain Miller took a measured step forward, maintaining respectful distance, and subtly adjusted his stance to reflect formal acknowledgement alignment, signaling to both personnel and command structure that the subject was no longer under evaluation but under historical recognition status. The trainees began to respond instinctively to the shift in authority energy, lowering unnecessary tension in their posture and adopting a more disciplined stillness as they observed the instructor's behavior change from evaluation mode to respect protocol mode. One trainee adjusted his grip slightly and then released unnecessary rigidity, mirroring the subtle recalibration occurring across the entire formation as understanding transitioned from uncertainty to structured awareness. The older man made a minimal movement, shifting his weight evenly and maintaining a neutral stance, not as a reaction to command, but as a natural stabilization within an environment that had finally aligned with verified classification. Sergeant Anderson updated all communication channels to reflect final confirmation status, ensuring that internal systems recorded the subject as a verified United States Marine Corps legacy combat engineering specialist with documented operational history under restricted review categories. Captain Miller maintained steady observation, now fully aware that the exercise framework had permanently shifted into institutional acknowledgement, and issued a final controlled instruction to preserve silence and respect posture until formal closure procedures were completed. The training range itself felt fundamentally altered, as if the operational purpose of the space had expanded beyond simulation into recognition of historical service presence, with every movement now carrying symbolic weight rather than procedural function. The formation remained intact, but its meaning had changed entirely, no longer defined by evaluation parameters, but by disciplined acknowledgement of a legacy figure whose presence had restructured the understanding of authority within the environment. The older man did not seek attention or validation beyond what protocol required, yet his quiet presence anchored the entire scene in a state of formal recognition that concluded the verification cycle with absolute procedural clarity and institutional respect. The secured recognition environment reached a stabilized state as all United States Marine Corps command channels completed final verification synchronization, confirming that the identity classification of the older man had transitioned fully from restricted evaluation status to formally acknowledged legacy designation within the institutional record system. Sergeant Kyle Anderson maintained procedural silence for several seconds after receiving the final confirmation signal, ensuring that all downstream communication nodes reflected consistent classification data before closing the verification loop and returning his focus to formation control. Captain Jason Miller stood in a composed supervisory stance, his attention fixed on the subject at the center of the training range, now fully recognized under formal acknowledgement protocol, with his posture reflecting the shift from instructional oversight to institutional respect alignment. Across the formation, the trainees remained disciplined and still, their understanding of the situation continuing to evolve as the behavioral responses of their instructors confirmed that the exercise had fully transitioned into a recognition event rather than a training evaluation scenario. The older man remained unchanged in position and demeanor, his presence steady and composed, as if the confirmation process had only aligned external institutional understanding with a reality that had been present from the beginning. Sergeant Anderson issued a controlled directive through secured channels instructing all personnel to maintain formal respect posture and ensure complete suspension of training simulation procedures, marking the official closure of all active exercise parameters. Captain Miller responded by adjusting his stance into a formal acknowledgement position, signaling complete acceptance of the recognition protocol outcome and reinforcing the shift in authority dynamics across the training environment. The trainees gradually adapted their posture in response to instructor behavior, lowering unnecessary tension and aligning their stance with the newly established respect protocol, while still processing the significance of the change without full access to classified information. One trainee subtly adjusted his equipment position to match formation discipline standards, while another remained completely still, observing the instructor's silent acknowledgement of the subject at the center of the range. The environment itself felt structurally altered, as if the training space had transitioned from operational evaluation grounds into a formal recognition site governed by institutional memory and verified historical service acknowledgement. Sergeant Anderson completed a final communication update confirming that all systems reflected accurate United States Marine Corps legacy classification status, ensuring no discrepancies remained within command records. Captain Miller maintained steady visual focus on the subject, now fully integrated into formal recognition protocol, and issued a restrained instruction to preserve silence until official closure procedures were completed by command authority. The older man made a minimal, controlled adjustment in stance, aligning into a neutral rest position that reflected neither deference nor assertion, but simple stability within a fully resolved procedural environment. The formation remained intact, yet its function had permanently shifted from evaluation under uncertainty to disciplined acknowledgement under confirmed identity, with every participant now operating under a unified understanding of respect protocol. The atmosphere across the range settled into structured stillness, where silence itself became part of the recognition process, and where authority was no longer expressed through instruction, but through acknowledgement of verified legacy presence within the United States Marine Corps institutional framework. The recognition protocol entered its final stabilization phase as all United States Marine Corps internal command systems completed cross-verification of the legacy service record, confirming absolute consistency across archived operational files and restricted classification layers associated with the older man standing at the center of the training range. Sergeant Kyle Anderson maintained strict procedural silence after final confirmation was received, holding position while ensuring that all communication channels reflected synchronized acknowledgement status, effectively closing the verification cycle at command-level authority. Captain Jason Miller remained in a formal supervisory stance, his attention fixed on the subject whose identity had now transitioned fully into institutional recognition, his posture reflecting the shift from training oversight to historical respect protocol. Across the formation, the trainees continued to hold disciplined positions, their understanding still developing as they observed the behavioral transition of their instructors from evaluation control to formal acknowledgement mode, a change that redefined the entire operational context of the training range. The older man remained steady and composed, his presence unchanged, as if the completion of verification had simply aligned institutional recognition with an already established reality. Sergeant Anderson issued a final control directive through secured channels confirming suspension of all active simulation parameters, marking the official termination of training protocol and the commencement of formal recognition procedure. Captain Miller responded by adopting a fully aligned respect posture, signaling complete acceptance of the verified legacy designation and reinforcing the institutional transition across the entire environment. The trainees gradually adjusted their stance in response to instructor behavior, lowering unnecessary tension and aligning with formal respect protocol, while still processing the significance of the moment without access to classified details. One trainee subtly corrected his equipment position to match disciplined rest posture, while another remained completely still, observing the shift in authority dynamics unfolding before him. The environment across the training range settled into structured stillness, where operational urgency had been replaced entirely by institutional acknowledgement and controlled silence. Sergeant Anderson completed the final administrative update across all communication systems, ensuring that United States Marine Corps archival records reflected fully verified legacy status without discrepancy or delay. Captain Miller maintained steady visual focus on the subject, now fully recognized under formal designation, and issued a restrained instruction to preserve silence until official closure confirmation was completed by higher command authority. The older man made a minimal and deliberate adjustment into neutral stance, reflecting stability within a fully resolved procedural environment, neither asserting nor withdrawing, simply existing within formal acknowledgement conditions. The formation remained intact, but its function had permanently transformed from training evaluation into disciplined recognition, where every participant operated under unified respect protocol rather than instructional hierarchy. The atmosphere of the range carried a quiet but absolute sense of resolution, as if the entire structure of command understanding had been recalibrated around a single verified presence. In this final state, silence itself became the governing principle of the environment, and the recognition of legacy replaced all previous operational objectives, concluding the procedural cycle with complete institutional clarity and respect. The final acknowledgement phase reached complete institutional closure as all United States Marine Corps archival systems confirmed synchronized validation of the legacy service record, locking the identity classification of the older man into permanent recognized status across all verified command databases. Sergeant Kyle Anderson completed the final procedural update and sealed the communication cycle, ensuring that no further verification queries remained active within the secured network, then stepped back into a formal respect posture that signaled absolute completion of recognition protocol. Captain Jason Miller maintained steady composure, his stance fully aligned with institutional acknowledgement standards, reflecting the final transition from training oversight authority into formal respect observance, as the operational purpose of the range had permanently shifted. Across the formation, the trainees stood in disciplined silence, their understanding now fully shaped by the visible transformation of command behavior, even without access to classified details, as they recognized that the individual at the center of the range had been elevated beyond standard evaluation categories into verified historical legacy status. The older man remained centered and unchanged, his presence calm and grounded, as if the entire procedural system surrounding him had simply confirmed what was already understood without need for explanation or demonstration. Sergeant Anderson issued a final controlled instruction confirming termination of all training activity, marking the official end of simulation protocol and the closure of the exercise environment under command authority. Captain Miller followed with a restrained acknowledgement, reinforcing formal respect posture across all personnel and ensuring that silence was maintained as part of the institutional closure process. The trainees adjusted their stance one final time, aligning fully into disciplined stillness, their movements now free of tension and uncertainty, reflecting complete acceptance of the altered command atmosphere. One trainee lowered his head slightly in silent recognition, while another maintained fixed forward attention, both responding instinctively to the gravity of the moment without verbal instruction. The environment across the training range settled into absolute quiet, where even operational background noise felt diminished under the weight of formal recognition protocol. Sergeant Anderson completed a final administrative synchronization across all secure systems, confirming that United States Marine Corps records reflected finalized legacy classification with no outstanding discrepancies or unresolved alerts. Captain Miller remained in place for several seconds longer than required by protocol, his attention fixed on the subject whose presence had redefined the structure of authority within the entire exercise. The older man made a final minimal adjustment into neutral rest posture, maintaining composure that reflected neither assertion nor withdrawal, but simple stability within a fully resolved institutional environment. The formation remained intact but had permanently transformed in meaning, no longer functioning as a training evaluation unit, but as a disciplined acknowledgement site where hierarchy had been temporarily suspended in favor of verified historical recognition. As the final procedural silence settled across the range, the recognition cycle concluded completely, leaving behind a stabilized environment where respect replaced instruction and legacy presence became the defining axis of understanding within the United States Marine Corps operational framework.